Hello everybody, and welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips. And I want to talk about processed foods today in a way that I haven't talked about them before, and I hope you find it interesting. So it is widely known, just to start talking about foods not to eat so much of, that a diet high in animal foods, particularly processed meats, increases the risk of many diseases, including cancer. But just reducing or eliminating animal foods, while good for the environment and good for the animals, doesn't necessarily result in significant health improvement for everybody and doesn't by itself lead to optimal health. In fact, many people who identify themselves as vegan or vegetarian are overweight or sick. And one of the reasons is that while they're not eating animal food, and that is a great step in the right direction, and we don't want to discourage that at all, they're eating an awful lot of processed and sometimes really highly processed food in the diet every day. NOVA, which is, by the way, not an acronym, is a classification system that categorizes food according to how the foods are processed. It's recognized as a tool that has usefulness in public health research and policy by groups such as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The NOVA system uses 4 groups, and the Group 1 foods are natural, unprocessed, or minimally processed foods. And the types of things you would see on this list are like edible plants, seeds, fruits, roots, like beets and potatoes, animal foods, eggs, and milk, foods that are processed in order to extend shelf life, like, for example, yogurt or fermented foods or roasted coffee, for example. There can be no added substances like salt, sugar, fats, that sort of thing. So as close to natural as possible. Group 2 foods are processed culinary ingredients like oil, butter, sugar, and salt. Group 3 are simpler foods that are made by adding sugar, oil, and salt. In other words, the addition of Group 2 things to the Group 1 foods. And these would include things like bread and cheese and canned foods, salted nuts, fruit and syrup, and cured meats. There would be some good things, some not so good things in that group. Group 4, as you might imagine, are the highly processed foods that contain ingredients like preservatives and sugar and whey protein and soy isolates and a hydrolyzed protein and oils and salt and fats and dyes and colors and flavoring agents and artificial sweeteners and the whole laundry list, and I think there are thousands of them at this point in time that are in food. NOVA describes these foods as deliberately formulated to be habit-forming, says that they're often falsely advertised as health foods. One of the reasons is that you can take foods like this and add vitamins. For example, Fruit Loops at one point in time was labeled a healthy food by one scoring system because of all the fortification. You know, they make a junk food product that's full of sugar and garbage, and then they add vitamins to it. So, but this stuff is not really health promoting, and it can cause, quote, troublesome effects on global nutrition and health. The other thing that NOVA says about these types of foods is that they're habit forming. People develop a taste for them and they want more and more and more of it, which is why somebody like me doesn't keep chocolate in the house, because if I start eating it, I start wanting some more of it. And I don't like to play willpower games with myself in the kitchen. While Group 4 foods have little redeeming value, most people are probably going to consume some of them, so we provide here at Wellness Forum some specific guidelines about how to do so safely. So if you look at our food pyramid, at the top of the pyramid we have this tiny, tiny little sliver, and it's called treats. And these are the times when you have things like a glass of wine or a cookie or a piece of chocolate or a piece of cake. And this is like your birthday, your parents' birthdays, holidays like Thanksgiving, New Year's Eve, Valentine's Day. And if a handful of times a year you have something like this is okay. The problem, and where we see so many people who are in trouble, is that this stuff becomes part of the daily fare. People eat it every day. And this is not food. There's a difference between the food that you eat for lunch today versus the treats that you have on your birthday. Well, as it turns out, our advice to limit these foods a lot is pretty well founded. A study shows that higher intake of ultra-processed foods is associated with a higher risk of cancer. I found this study really interesting for several reasons, which I'll tell you about at the end, but it was a prospective study that included over 104,000 adults, average about 42.8 years, who completed online questionnaires regularly concerning their intake of 3,300 food items. Consumption of ultra-processed foods, as defined by the criteria that I just described for you, was associated with increased cancer risk. In fact, for every 10% increase in the proportion of these foods in the diet, the incidence of overall cancer increased by 12%, and the incidence of breast cancer specifically by 11%. The researchers controlled for several things like lipid, sodium, and carbohydrate intake, which means that the processing itself was shown to have an impact on health. It may be that the byproducts of processing and heating, such as acrylamide, would be one byproduct, or the additives in highly processed foods are at least partially responsible for the negative effect on health. Now, one of the things is individual processed foods sometimes have very low amounts of additives, but the cumulative effect of eating lots of this stuff every day is the problem, and that may be what is significant and causing the issue. The study's strengths included that the cohort was large, over 104,000 people. The data were self-reported, and that's often highly unreliable. One thing that people tend to do is over-report the good things they eat and under-report the bad things they eat. But this was a little bit higher quality because the way that the data were collected is 24-hour dietary records. So if you asked me to write down what I ate yesterday, I probably would come up with a pretty accurate thing. Now, if you asked me to tell you how many times I had cantaloupe in the last 6 months, I have absolutely no idea. It would be a guesstimate at best. But this was done, it was a better methodology. The researchers acknowledged that in this study, as with most volunteer cohorts, there were more women. Women tend to engage in more health-promoting behaviors than men do, and this group was more educated than the general population. And so what they said is that while the effect was pronounced in this group, it might be even greater in the general population. So the bottom line is that optimal health is not going to be achieved by just making a list of things you're not going to eat. You have to get out of the avoiding business and get into the choosing business. And so one thing that I tell people all the time, and this might be helpful for you, is I wrote a book called Food Over Medicine. People like it a lot. I look at food as medicine. So let's build on that. And the way that I do that is, in my mind, there are 3 categories of foods. And there are all kinds of ways that you can categorize. I mean, I just described to you how Nova does it. But in my mind, for the purposes of what we're talking about here, you have bad foods, dairy and oil. Try to avoid. You don't want to eat them, all right? Then you've got these foods in the middle. I call them the no harm, no foul. This is rice crackers, and we all eat some of that kind of thing. And I've never had anybody in the office where we said, my gosh, it's so sad that you're so sick, and it was those rice crackers that did it. I mean, this is stuff that's not, it's not going to kill you, but it's not going to help you either. And this is the thing. This type of, maybe vegan and all that sort of thing, but it's pretty processed stuff. It's not going to help you build a strong body. So then you go to the third category, and this is the food as medicine, and you start to think of it as drugs. So you walk into the grocery store and you say, there's a class of drugs called cruciferous vegetables. I better get some of those. And then there's a class of drugs called root vegetables, beets and potatoes and carrots. I'm going to get some of those. And then there's a class of drugs called leafy greens and fruit. And when you start to look at that, these are the drugs. You have to take the prescription several times a day. And that's what we're encouraging here. If you want to use food as medicine, you got to make sure that the vast majority of the food you are eating is medicinal. And that's not just eating vegan stuff or plant-based stuff. It's really choosing optimal food. So this transition, I think all of us start out in the avoiding business. I did. It's easy to make a list of stuff you're not going to eat. It's much harder to figure out how to structure a diet comprised of optimal foods that actually do lead to health. So I hope that this is helpful, but a really good incentive to take your diet to the next level and get out of this eating of so much processed food. Want to remind you, we are right in the throes of Breast Cancer Awareness Month. We're getting pledges, and people are distributing the pledge forms and getting women to commit to do something active to reduce the risk of breast cancer. We have a great online lecture for women to watch who sign the pledge card. So if you want to get involved in this campaign, please send me an email at pampopper@msn.com. We'll get back to you right away, get you set up, and you can help us to reach hundreds of thousands. Let's go for millions of women. I like to think big sometimes. Let's go for millions of women and really help them reduce the risk of cancer in a meaningful way. All right, if you're not a subscriber, hit the subscribe button. And the little bell in the corner is if you want to be notified when we post new videos. And as usual, pass this on to anybody who you think might enjoy watching it. And I will be back to you next Tuesday with more news.